Welcome to another episode of Red Star. And it's me, Ammar Ali Jan, with my co host, Pawel Wargan, who is finally with us today. And we have a very, very special guest with us, Gabriel Rockhill. Gabriel Rockhill is a philosopher, cultural critic, and activist. He has been in the news. There's been a lot of discussion that he's provoked with his work, his critique of what he calls the theory industry, his critique of academia and its very intimate relationship with empire, with the US military and intelligence apparatus. And it's actually one of the most fascinating debates that we're witnessing in academia and in the political sphere in the last few years, because a lot of us were trained in this academia, in this particular theory industry without even realizing it. And I think it's been his arrival onto the scene has been a bit of a shock to a lot of people. And that is partly why it's created a lot of controversies, and we'll get a chance to discuss some of those today. He is also a professor of philosophy at Villanova University and a founder and executive director of the Critical Theory Workshop. And that is also one of the most brilliant resources for all our comrades who are interested. Gabriel Rockhill and Dr. Jennifer, they've been working on this critical theory workshop for a very long time now. And I would recommend all of you to check out their work, which is available on YouTube. Well, welcome again, Gabriel. It's great to have you here. I must also say that I am one of your unofficial promoters of your work in South Asia. So I'm going to claim royalties at some point.
Very good. If I had a lot, I'd give them to you for sure. It's wonderful to be on with both of you, and I appreciate the work you're doing at the Red Star. So support it fully, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. So just to start off with, you were recently in China. And I say that because, China has been on everybody's mind, particularly in the US, but also within leftist circles. There are all kinds of wild debates about what China represents in the contemporary moment. And the new Cold War, of course, is heating up. So I just want to begin with getting a sense of what your impressions were of China as a philosopher, as a political thinker, as a public intellectual, and how do you place what you saw in the larger history of anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism?
I think China is really at the core of the anti-imperialist struggle today. That's one of the reasons that it's in the crosshairs of the US empire. And I've been studying China now for years because I wanted to understand the evolution of its socialist project. And a lot of the Western Marxist framing of that project was that China just went capitalist and neoliberal and maybe even imperialist, beginning with Deng Xiaoping and the reform and opening up. And it's very clear to me, Domenico Lasordo, who I'm sure we'll talk about, writes very poignantly about this in Class Struggle, demonstrating that what Deng Xiaoping and the leadership in China was doing with the reform and opening up is slowly opening up to forms, capitalist investment from abroad based on technology transfer in a very slow and gradual process in order to see whether or not it could practically transform itself and develop its productive forces by using elements from capitalism, but keeping the control of the state and the towering heights of the economy. And when you see the consequences from that project, both theoretically, because as I said, I've been studying it, but then also practically when you're on the ground, it's a truly remarkable set of developments that one has before one's eyes. The largest poverty alleviation program in the history of humanity, 850 million people, that surpasses the total population of Latin America. So we should just pause and think to ourselves, there is a country on earth that has literally eliminated extreme poverty for the equivalent of a continent, right? That alone demonstrates that the way in which the value that's produced by the workers in China is not simply taken by a parasitic class, and it's not purely capitalist, because there's a clear redistribution of that to social welfare across the board. But that's only one sign among many others, of course. Standards of living have increased dramatically. I met with Ali Qadri when I was there, and he did calculations that demonstrated that in a 10-year time period, workers' wages tripled. Now, I'm in the United States where the minimum wage is just over $7 an hour, and it's been stagnant, and real wages have been stagnant for a very, very long time. So tripling in a decade is truly, truly incredible. China's a leader in science and technology, as we know, with the recent innovations in AI and other such things. It leads the way in addressing the climate crisis. The society itself is highly stable, and the government enjoys an outstanding level of popularity, unlike in the United States. And when you see it on the ground, two things that are very clear is that the value produced does not just flow up. It manifests itself in the wealth of society, because you see the infrastructure projects are incredible. All of the public transportation, there are literally flowers lining the highways, right? In Philadelphia, there are beggars, homeless people, and usually people driven to crime because of the level of immiseration. That's what lines the highways in Philadelphia. And they have a project clearly of a lot of the agricultural workers, due to the industrialization of agriculture, now going to the city. And the state has overseen and hiring them to work on horticultural projects to make life more beautiful for everyone. The cities are spotless. There are so many electric vehicles that you don't hear or smell a lot of the pollution. There is no visible crime. The cops don't even have, weapons because they don't need them, or I certainly didn't see any. And you don't see the social pathologies that you get in the United States. In Philadelphia, there's a region called Kensington that is known as Zombie Land, because people literally walk around in opiate-induced zombie-like trances. And you go through the neighborhood and it's constant. You see it everywhere. You don't see any of those social pathologies at least I didn't. And I've been in a number of different cities across China. So it's quite impressive. And what I would encourage people to do is study it theoretically. And if you get the chance, just go and see it with your own eyes. Also see it on social media, because there's plenty to see there as well. But seeing it with your own eyes, there's nothing quite like it.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm sure we'll come back to your opinion on China when we discuss Lesotho. And here I want to go to you, Pawel. You have been to China a few times. And so what are the changes you've seen? What are your impressions? Because you are a leading member of the Progressive International, and you've been giving solidarity to movements in the global south. You've helped us, you've helped many other movements, theoretically, intellectually. When you look at China as part of the work that you do, the work of solidarity with the global south, what does China mean to you, and what was your experience there?
Yeah, thank you. So maybe I'll share two thoughts, one anecdotal and one more analytical. The anecdotal one is simply, from my own impressions of the country. The first time I was in China was about 10 years ago. And the kind of boogeyman story of the day was about the runaway pollution that's destroying Beijing, which was true at the time. And the media favorite, which was the ghost cities, the supposed, inefficiencies and irrationalities inherent in socialist planning, which produced these sprawling metropolises without residents. Or, metro stations somewhere in the middle of a field that had apparently been misplanned or misdirected. And that was the story. And you could see them from trains. You had these large empty cities. And it is true, when I was first there, Beijing was covered and enveloped in a thick smog where sometimes you couldn't see across the road. It was quite devastating. But the last time I was there, all of that had changed. The so-called ghost cities are thriving, are technologically far superior to many of the cities we have in the West. They are clean, as Gabriel said. They are orderly. They are safe. People have good standards of living there. And the air in Beijing is clear. And I was absolutely stunned to see, a blue sky and a sunny day last time I was there. So the tendency, which you can see with your own eyes, and it's, the tripling of living standards in a 10-year period is a startling statistic, but I think you can see it if you visit China over a period of time. There is an improvement across the board in terms of development, in terms of social advancement, in terms of people's well-being, that is incomparable to anything else in the world at the moment. And so as just through that, China is a phenomenon in its own right. And I find it deeply unfortunate that so many on the left, so many on the Western left, are so reluctant to even study the process of Chinese socialist construction seriously, because there is a lot to be gained from understanding what's happening in China seriously and on its own terms. So that's one kind of impression from my own time there. The second one is kind of more of an analytical point about where China fits in the history of the internationalist struggle, and this is kind of comes from a conversation I had with a professor at Fudan University, the School of Marxism at Fudan University and Shanghai University in Shanghai. We talked about what it means to build an internationalist project in the 21st century, in a historical moment in which the primary contradiction is no longer national liberation from direct colonialism, but one where you have formal political sovereignty, but no economic sovereignty. So you have the kind of hard shell of political liberation that has yet to be filled with economic liberation. And so, what does it mean to recalibrate, move away from the position of the Third International, which saw as its task the supporting of national liberation movements, armed national liberation movements against colonialism? What does it mean to move past that and to build an internationalism in a situation in which countries are seeking simply to establish economic sovereignty against imperialism? And we kind of came to the conclusion that projects like the Belt and Road Initiative are precisely that, because they are delivering in a very real way the material basis of sovereign development. They're building highways, they're building productive capacities, they're building airports, they're building ports, they're building the means by which states which have been denied the possibility of trading with one another, which have been designed in a sense by colonial powers to for extraction by colonial and imperial monopolies, now find themselves in a position where they can trade with others on more favorable terms, and that's creating the conditions for an entirely different kind of international politics. So I think China, is the central player and the central driving force in an internationalism of the 21st century. And maybe if you'll allow me to go on a little tangent very briefly, yesterday the Progressive International convened an event in The Hague where we brought together 9 countries, representatives of the foreign ministries of 9 countries, to form a bloc, which is called the Hague Group, which is really the first bloc outside of the axis of resistance to take coordinated diplomatic and legal measures against Israel, specifically in relation to the genocide in Palestine. And the 3 measures are basically to they involve include a commitment to respect the ICC warrants against senior Israeli leadership, and commitments to block the supply of arms and energy that powers the military. So it's a very kind of seismic development, and I think it reflects precisely the fact that in this historic moment, new pathways have opened up for countries to engage politically with one another within the global South, which has emboldened them in ways that we haven't seen since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so there's something very, very important happening in terms of the recalibration of the international system. And I'll leave it at that, but I hope we can talk a little bit more about the decline of imperialism and the rise of a new kind of third world project and what that means for the prospects.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that, Pawel, particularly mentioning this event that was hosted by the Progressive International. And it seems like with the international order collapsing, there are all these new opportunities that are opening up. China just announced that with America's withdrawal from WHO, they will take care of WHO. Similarly, with Hague now, you have these 9 countries of the global South who are taking responsibility. Similarly, with the crisis with Colombia, CELAC, the Organization of Caribbean Latin American Countries, is coming together. We have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization here in our region, Pakistan, China, Russia, India. So It's a very interesting moment. But if we from here, if we go to some of the debates that you guys mentioned, which is as Pavel you said, it's unfortunate that many leftist intellectuals are unable to see the actual transformations that are happening, the significance of these transformations. And this brings us to one of our masters, Domenico Losordo, our teacher, someone whose book, Western Marxism, I particularly like, precisely because he talks about these two ways of conceptualizing the world. One is what he calls this messianic conception, where the only way you can support any kind of a struggle is if it ends all kinds of contradictions, all kinds of oppressions all at once. And then the reality of the world, which of course has a very torturous, contradictory path that history actually takes when it's changing. Gabriel, maybe if you can talk a little bit about how this messianic uh, element within Marxism, how was it elevated? Because my understanding is that there are two ways in which the issue of academic Marxism can be looked at. One is this actual um, deep, intimate connection between the Western empires, in particularly the U.S. empire now, and academia, which is a more direct and simplistic analysis. And it's true that a lot of people are embedded, and you on your work are showing that some of the big names were deeply embedded. But also the impact that it has on a lot of graduate students and young faculty, the disciplining mechanism of this need to be accepted, which you rightly call the compatible left, and the idea that you must take a position that eschews any kind of contradiction, any kind of messiness. So it has to be you're with the people, that kind of stuff. So how would you ground this tendency of academic leftists or Western leftists to take these safe positions in the larger theorization that you're doing with your work on the theory industry?
Well, I think those positions are what we could refer to as the dogmatism of the empire, because the way that we need to perceive the Western left is as being driven ultimately by the socioeconomic base, not in some mechanical or rigorously determinist manner, but the reason that you have a Western quote unquote left intelligentsia is because it's a product of an imperial superstructure, meaning a network of cultural and intellectual institutions that have historically produced and then conditioned the work of that intelligentsia. And in that regard, it's the whole history of empire that undergirds this particular class formation and its ideological orientations and its practices. In that regard, there is also then a dimension to this that you just alluded to, which is that it's not just that you have these powerful educational institutions, publishing networks, conference networks, the news and media apparatus. All of that is part of a larger imperial superstructure driven by the United States, but with many junior partners who have their own somewhat distinct superstructures, but they're driving in the same imperial direction. But that's combined with intellectual imperialism, right? So around the world, the marching orders in the capitalist world, at least, are usually given by the leading capitalist forces. So if you happen to be an intellectual in India, in Argentina, in Poland, or elsewhere, you more or less need to be at some level in conversation with the dominant discourse. And the dominant discourse they don't mention is an imperial discourse. It's the imperial dogmatism that trains and dominates so much of that Western left. And you're right, it's compatible in precisely the way that the US national security state has understood it as compatible, meaning that it appears to be left. It often postures in such a way that it uses radical discourse, a lot of hand waving, a lot of symbology. There are books with cars burning on the cover of them and fist pumps in the air and all of this. But all of this symbolism is just a fig leaf that is masking really what is ultimately a capitalist accommodationist and often imperialist accommodationist set of positions, which then brings me more specifically to the ideology that tends to be dominant within, and you're right, it's Western left, or we could just call it the imperial left, with all of the comprador intellectual positions that are occupied around the world, right? Because this has to be seen as a kind of world system and not simply in terms of, one region or specific regions of the world. But the overall orientation tends to be a primacy of theory over and against a primacy of practice. And if you're a Marxist who thinks that there are perfect ideas of what socialism is supposed to look like, and either, Marx and Engels or somebody else discovered this and laid it out for all time, or you have in your own idiosyncratic vocabulary developed a perfect idea of what socialism is supposed to look like, and you look at the extant world and it doesn't map onto that perfect idea, then you can withdraw in horror and say, oh, these people who thought they could liberate themselves through material struggle, but actually they've just led us in a horrific direction because what I see in the world doesn't map onto my idea of what socialism should be. And it's very important on that front to point out that this is an extremely underdeveloped and even regressive intellectual and political position. It's operating at the level of what Hegel, and of course Marx, Mao, and others drew on Hegel in theorizing in this way, refers to as sense perception. You have an idea in your mind, you look at the world, and it's not my idea, therefore you reject it. This is the mirror opposite of a materialist analysis that examines how the world actually works in all of its complex contradictions, forces pulling in many different directions, and it recognizes that when it's about building socialism in the real world, not in your mindscape, that requires inevitably, and has required if you study material history, tactical sacrifices that might appear to contradict the overall strategy, right? So the strategy is the end goal of where we're headed, and the tactics are the little stepping stones to get there. There are many examples one could point to, like the environmental footprint of China, particularly through the kind of intense coal burning years. And China continues to be, in 2023, it was the world's leading coal builder. So it has a coal burner. So it has not worked through all of these contradictions. But if you understand that for socialist countries to develop in an imperialist world, they need to develop the productive forces, and they need to do that quickly. And they come from a hind start because of the depredation inherent in the history of colonialism. In order to do that, they do need to make certain sacrifices along the way that are short-term sacrifices, and that those contradictions will be worked through and overcome in the medium and long term if the country stays on the socialist path, right? And this is one of the reasons that there are so many brilliant, truly brilliant strategic thinkers within the world socialist movement, because they understood this. They understood that where they needed to get wasn't just a kind of end game in this messianic sense, but it was something that required tactical sacrifices, sometimes stepping one step back to make two steps forward, and that was the only way of advancing the project. This is what strategic thinking looks like and strategic practice looks like when you do materialist analysis. But when you're an armchair academic and the main thing that you're invested in is virtue signaling to your fellow academics that you are on the right side of history because you do not traffic in these type of horrific compromises, it's more about the kind of beautiful soul of the academic untinged by the sulfur of class struggle. And so the final thing that I'll say is, for people like us, and I think many of your viewers and listeners, it's really important to recognize that if the goal is to really liberate humanity and save the planet, we have to do that practically. We can't do that by writing a text about what the world would look like if people just followed my marching orders. Therefore, we have to be strategic thinkers, and we have to be materialist in our analysis of actually existing socialism. Doesn't mean that you celebrate everything, that you blindly embrace anything that waves the flag of socialism. But what it means is that you recognize that the dialectics, the material dialectics of socialism in the real world looks very different than some perfect blueprint that a pristine intellectual in the imperial core would conjure in their minds.
Absolutely. This is why I find your work to be very fascinating, because, when we were undergrad and graduate students, one of the things that was like one of the mantras of even the actually existing Western Marxists, and here I like your term, Imperial Marxists, was that the experience of the 20th century of Marxism is an experience of failures. They've failed. And the only way to make Marxism alive again is to return to Marx. I mean, they took it from Althusser, but all kinds of returns were happening. Moshe Postone was doing it. Many other Frankfurt School inspired, American analytical school. And it was very, very odd to hear that argument. If this is a theory of practice, or if it's an attempt to theorize practice, why would you dismiss 120, 30 years of practice to return to the text, to the original text? And it's very weird that they would often say that actually Marxism became a religion in China and Russia, except that no, going back to the text, going back to the Quran or the Bible sounds way more of a religion than actually tactical compromises. The new economic policy of Lenin does not sound like a religion. It sounds like a tactical innovation. Deng Xiaoping's work sounds like an innovation. Third world Marxism in general, national liberation movements and its fusion with Marxism sounds like an innovation. So it's very weird that actually it's the arrogance of academic Marxists, the fact that they maybe read fourth volume of Das Kapital that hasn't even been published or written, makes them superior to all those people who fought and sacrificed in the battlefields in the name of Marxism and the Red Flag. Which also leads me to one more question, and then I'll go back to Pawel. In terms of this kind of departure from Messianism, Lusordo, one of the least discussed works of Lusordo, or his concepts that I find to be extremely fascinating, is his ranking of class struggles. So he has this book on class struggles. He suggests that class struggle is not a binary struggle between the worker and the factory owner. In fact, there are multiple class struggles, and three that he mentions are struggles of workers and women and gender in general, and national liberation. So these are all struggles for recognition of their humanity against the denial of that humanity by those in power. But what he complicates that entire narrative by saying that it's not simply a question of adding one struggle onto another. So it's an additive kind of a process where we can just add all these struggles and not take any controversial position. In fact, actual history presents you situations where you have to choose between different struggles or create a hierarchy, a ranking of class struggles. At this moment, when Gaza, for example, is being bombarded, maybe at that point, in the midst of a genocide, it's less important to talk about gender in this particular case than or talk about gender in the classical sense as it used to be in before this genocide. Similarly, in the case of Vietnam, it was, they created these fronts that also not just had the working class, but they also had the peasantry. They even had some national bourgeoisie. So the question of class was secondary to the question of national liberation. In that case, there's always this difficulty of ranking. And I feel like one of the problems with imperial Marxism, academic Marxism, is that they're too scared to ever decide on that ranking because they fear getting canceled, or I don't know what that fear is. Thankfully, I'm not in the American Academy anymore. But in terms of political decisions have to exclude as well. They can't just be inclusive. You also have to say what Mao used to call the principal contradiction. Maybe I want to hear your thoughts on Lusordo's emphasis on this work, and he gives brilliant examples from Lincoln, the Civil War. If you are a liberal, you may hate Lincoln for suspending habeas corpus, arresting editors, denying the right to protest. And yet he's the hero of all liberals, and rightly so in many ways. Marx also liked him because he was able to rank all these liberties and say the biggest question for the Union was the question of slavery. Why have we lost this ability, and how can we recuperate it today?
Excellent comments and questions. Can I just start with the first thing that you said about the correlation between the imperial Marxists and the embrace of failure is very telling, because it's clear that this is from a theoreticist point of view. Because if you do a historical materialist analysis of the long 20th century, between at least the 1940s, after the Soviet Union working with China, some 47 million Soviets and Chinese, the overwhelming majority of whom were communists, defeated the world historical attempt to impose fascism across the East and, for that matter, the West. And so that, as a defeat, really, if you take that position, amounts to being Nazi apologist and fascist apologist. But then on top of that, you have decades up to at least the 1970s when the global socialist movement is expanding through national liberation struggles that are, for the most part, successfully, when they are successful, are led by Marxists. So you're just ignoring history. And this was a history that I was taught. I remember being trained as a Marxist and thinking, well, I'm just going to hang out and wring my hands and say, oh, I just wish that things were better, when in fact, things were objectively getting better for millions, literally millions of people around the world. But those people didn't matter because they were in the colonial periphery. And so you see very clearly the social chauvinism and just the rank Eurocentric arrogance of a lot of the imperial Marxists. And I should note that the ideology is interesting because it's driven by the socioeconomic base. But within the superstructure, there are often forces that pull and accentuate elements that come out of the base. And I say that because in my own archival research, I've discovered that the Rockefeller Foundation funded a project called the Marxism-Leninism Project. In the 1950s and 1960s, they put millions, literally millions of dollars into this, funding intellectuals, institutions, scholarly exchanges, junkets, dissertations, publications, translations, on and on and on. And what was the goal? It was to do precisely what Ammar just described. Denigrate Marxism in the East insofar as it leads to the totalitarian hellscape, which is the reality of actually existing socialism, in the name of what? A return to authentic Marxism, going back to the text of Marx in this kind of religious manner. And I also really appreciated, Ammar, in your earlier question as well, you highlighted the messianism, and now we have the textualism. We have to recognize as well that ideologies in the contemporary forms often graft themselves on to earlier extant ideologies, and religious ideology undergirds a lot of the dominant ideologies that continue to exist under capitalism. And we see it here with the imperial Marxism and certain tendencies to be Marxological, messianic, and there are other such tendencies. But getting to the core of your question, the ranking of class struggles, it really has to do with an approach to the world that is first and foremost materialist as opposed to theoretical. So a theoretical approach would say, well, we need everything to be perfect right now, and everyone to be liberated from racism, misogyny, imperialism, class exploitation, et cetera, and we have to save the environment. And if we don't do that all right now, then we're not truly socialist. Right? So there's a kind of imperative of messianic immediacy. Otherwise, it is fully compromised. But if you're actually involved in political struggles, then you know full well that it's not possible to do that. Like, materially speaking, it simply is not possible to do that given the extant play of forces. And so a materialist analysis begins the other way around. Not what's my perfect idea and how does the world not map onto it, but what's the extant play of forces and how can we move things in the best possible direction. And in doing that, as Lusordo demonstrates in Marxist support for the liberation from slavery, there are often kind of tactical compromises or a recognition that one contradiction comes to the fore and becomes the primary contradiction in that particular historical conjuncture. So the elevation of human beings outside of the most abject forms of labor that are super exploitative and oppressive, meaning slavery, becomes the necessary focal point at that point in time, even more so than the struggle to like immediately abolish capitalism, right? And that is, I think, on the part of Marx and then Lisordo, the recognition of the primacy of practice, and that if the goal is to fight and win, you're going to have to fight these interim struggles that might look like they're making compromises, because you're not just abolishing capitalism all of a sudden, right? And that's quintessentially important because the primacy of practice is linked to the principle that the goal of fighting is to win. Whereas a lot of the imperialist Marxists, if they do fight, they often fight in such a way that they lose, but with the glory of being principled, of maintaining the sanctity and the purity of their particular intellectual positions, right? And so if you look at the long history of the Marxist tradition, there are many tactical compromises that are made along the way, and that's often how success has spelled itself out, right? Lisordo describes how when Lenin introduced the NEP and had elements of capitalist investment within the country, many Bolsheviks tore up their cards and was like, this isn't what I signed up for. But Lenin understood they needed capitalist investment to develop the productive forces. If we relate this to the contemporary situation in West Asia, there are many on the imperial left who, or you could say the same thing about Ukraine, for instance, they don't have a materialist analysis of the situation. So they say, well, and it's very metaphysical. You either have to support one thing or you reject another thing, and there's no variegated analysis, no dialectical analysis. So if you say, for instance, well, Hamas is a resistance force against a settler colonial imperial project, we don't necessarily support the full ideology that Hamas represents, but we recognize that they're the principal anti-imperialist force in that region at this point in time. And therefore, you can have, you can think two things at once. And it's one thing that the imperial left, in its dogmatism and its reductive metaphysics, doesn't want to allow us to think. Just as you can think in the case of the Ukraine that it is a NATO-backed proxy war against Russia and ultimately China, and that Russia pushing back against NATO-driven imperialism is something that one can understand from a tactical point of view without then embracing and saying, well, Hamas is the solution to all problems in West Asia. Russia is the solution to all problems in that region of the world. And what we need is a lot more refined, materialist, tactical analysis of practical situations, and then strategic thinking about how it is, if you're going to fight and win against imperialism, and we don't have a global socialist movement that is so strong that it could do that on its own, then you need to find ways of supporting, working with forces that aren't exactly ideologically aligned, because the point is to fight and win, not to maintain purist principles and fight and lose.
Yeah.
Well, that was brilliant. Yeah.
If I can jump in quickly, I mean, reading your work, Gabriel, but also hearing, in particular, your answer to the last question. I've been thinking a lot about the context of my own region, which is Eastern Europe. I was born in Poland in 1991, just as our socialist project crumbled and just on the cusp of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And this was a time when dialecticians were being expelled from the academy. In fact, one of the first things that was done in Eastern Germany when it was absorbed by the West was the closing down of departments of Marxism in universities. You had these really tragic images. Of course, I was too young to see them, to remember. These really tragic pictures you can find online now of bins heaped with portraits of Marx and Lenin and Engels, and of course, books on Marxism. What happened as a consequence is the entire framework of reasoning about history and about class changed very quickly. Most importantly, in that the workers were written out of history, effectively. Right? We had this long period of class struggle in the 1990s, this backlash to the intense and vicious neoliberal reforms that were imposed on us. No one remembers those struggles. They were very quickly co-opted, dismantled. pushed by forces of reaction into disorganization. Then many of the countries of Eastern Europe joined NATO and fell prey to the so-called NGO industrial complex, which is a very interesting phenomenon. And goes back to what you said about the construction in the image of the U.S. foreign policy interests of an entire intellectual professional class whose job is to shape perceptions and ideologies within countries that are subordinate to U.S. empire. And we see that in a way, there's a very interesting phenomenon now with Donald Trump rescinding funding for many of these USAID and National Endowment for Democracy programs, where, in countries like Georgia, and Sopo Japaridze, a good comrade, has done great work on this, there were more NGOs per capita than doctors at one point. They had something like 25,000 Western-funded NGOs for a population of 3 or 4 million. And they form the backbone of the country's middle class. And this is true in places like Bosnia and other countries in the Balkans. This is true in Ukraine. I imagine this is true in large parts of the Baltic states. And it's also true of parts of the kind of liberal Russian opposition, who had claimed for the longest time to be independent and independently minded. And all of a sudden, all these people find themselves without money and out of work, which is a deeply revealing moment, even though, we don't celebrate Trump's foreign policy, understanding that there are other drivers for it. But again, this moment reveals this vast, vast infrastructure that involves tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people, which was set up precisely to shape ideologies both on the left and on the right in the service of US foreign policy. And the consequence of that is that at their best, Marxists in Eastern Europe stop at Lenin, Trotsky, or Stalin, potentially, or in very few cases go on to Mao, both ignoring the entire intellectual tradition of their own socialist projects. But I think more importantly, and this is what Ammar talked about, ignoring the entire intellectual trajectory of third world Marxism and national liberation Marxism, which really transformed and enhanced and evolved our understanding of what imperialism is and what it means to resist it. And so we're in this kind of stasis at our best intellectually. And of course, at our worst, we have a Marxism or a leftism, which is ahistorical, anti-dialectical, and ignorant of class as a driving force in society. And that is the dominant left throughout Eastern Europe at the moment, unfortunately. And so we face this really tremendous impasse where it's unclear to me how we get out of this particular position in, the next generation, at least. We're in a position where, a color revolution, which is directly drawn from the CIA playbook, will be celebrated as something progressive, precisely because these ideas of socialism and revolution and transformation have been abstracted from history and have been allowed to take on kind of new forms. So I don't know, Gabriel, if you've considered or studied or looked at the Eastern European example, but I'd be very keen to hear your reflections on some of these things that we see, these protest movements that lead to nothing, these NGO NGO-driven protagonism of progressive quote-unquote forces in these places. Have you looked into that phenomenon? What do you make of it?
Yes, no, absolutely. And I think that one of the things that you see in the history of US imperialism in the region is that a lot of what the US did between the kind of 1940s and 1970s is they invested in covert operations of various sorts, usually bringing, millions and millions of dollars to mobilize the actors on the ground. And it was across the board, right? These were political parties, unions, associations, women's organizations, racial organizations, religious organizations, the intelligentsia, the press, just every dimension of society. They tried to have their people in place to be able to control it. And usually they did that not necessarily just through a one-to-one relationship, but what they wanted to do is control the infrastructure, right? I often say that if you think of the CIA in terms of having marionettes, the problem is that you can see the strings of the marionettes. And the way that the CIA has tended to like to work is, well, they just buy and control the marionette theater, and the marionettes come of their own free will, so nobody sees the strings. And there's a lot of that, which is not to say that sometimes there aren't direct strings attached. So don't get me wrong, but you need to see the larger infrastructural framework. And then in the 1970s, there were so many revelations about the covert operations that you do see a shift. And we have to think of this dialectically. It's not like everything changed in the imperial orientation, but like Solidarność in Poland, it came out within a year. The principal funder was CIA, right? But in order to recuperate, because it's a complex movement with people pushing in different directions, but they wanted to make sure it was a kind of petty bourgeois, Western-oriented anti-communist movement, and that's why they funded it. But from the 1970s and on, you really see a shift to overt operations through the foundation mechanism. You have Ford, Rockefeller, Mellon, et cetera, around the world, parachuting money into all the projects they want to support, and the NGOification, right, which is precisely what you were just talking about. And I should note that it's somewhat tangential, but given that we're talking about the imperial intelligentsia, Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault were both, and I spell this out in some detail in a book that I'm currently finishing, directly involved in anti-communist destabilization campaigns. Foucault in Poland, Derrida in Czechoslovakia, and they have the entire infrastructure that is identical to the infrastructure that we're talking about. So one of the main organizations that Derrida worked for happened to be funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. The founder, Alan Weinstein, of course, is on record saying that the NED does today overtly what the CIA has done historically covertly. So recognizing that it's a government agency that does the exact same type of work. And so the intelligentsia has been involved in this very, very deeply. And the other point that I'd like to make is that NGOification, the control of the middle layer and the intelligentsia, the journalists, the pundits, the professors, the researchers, et cetera, is so important because then it manages the minds of the masses. And we've inherited the world, and Pawel, I really appreciate the kind of urgency of the question that you raised, because ultimately we're diagnosing these things historically, but the real question is what is to be done and how can we do it now? Because the thread has been cut. The thread to third world Marxism, to revolutionary struggles and national liberation struggles, at least within a lot of the core intelligentsia, that thread has been cut. And new institutions through the NGOification and a lot of other things have replaced them. And so there's a dogmatic dismissal of actually existing socialism that is more or less required for many members of the intelligentsia. So I think one of the essential tasks is reconnecting that thread, linking ourselves to the deep knowledge base that is the third world Marxist set of struggles that have not all won, have not all been perfect, but have contributed to a collective knowledge base that we need to reunite with and continue learning from in various ways. But in order to do that, we need to build infrastructure, right? We actually need systems in place that are parties, associations, educational platforms, news outlets, everything that the imperial ruling class does, we need to do, but we have to do it like scrappy outsiders who are underfunded, who don't have the reach and the support and everything else. We have to do people's media and people's education. And that is honestly, I think, at least at the level of theoretical class struggle, one of the single most important things. So that, you know, I could speak personally, and this is the last thing I'll say on this, if 25 years ago that infrastructure had been in place, I would be a much more, how to put it, much smarter, I guess, just to put it simplistically, because the infrastructure would have been there to train me in such a way that I wasn't trained in Western Marxism and French theory and all of the other things that I learned. And we have to do that for the next generation. And we have to do it very, very quickly. So not just the next generation, but everybody across the board, so that there's a kind of funnel that brings people in, provides them with the tools and resources necessary to understand how the world works and how to change it, because it's on a crash course that is destroying the conditions of possibility of human existence on planet Earth. So the urgency could not be higher.
Well, thank you for that, Gabriel. Just from what both of you are saying, when we say it's Western Marxism, one of the most unfortunate things is that a lot of Eastern Marxists, maybe the Comprador Marxists, if that's a term that one can use, are also learning from the same textbook. And even, I mean, in terms of reading our own history of national liberation, of Marxist movements in our region, I'm based here in Pakistan, there's a sense of shame, which I think has been induced, mediated via these circuits of the global theory industry. So there's a lot of shame attached to what our elders did. And every new Marxist who returns after an undergrad degree from Columbia University wants to tell us here in Pakistan that you guys got it wrong. Here is this latest fad in anthropology, and if you only read this guy, you could have like course corrected and become a more successful left. Like the amount of arrogance that comes with the theory industry, it's I feel like I was also like that maybe when I returned from the US. I hope not, maybe not as obnoxious, but literally like a lot of young people, very nice do-gooders, they clearly are leftists and have been trained in the West. But this idea that there's some kind of deep truth that you can get through the texts that they're being taught in the universities, and it's often a critique of where the old left went wrong. Pawel was very generous when he said the left stops with Lenin, Stalin, Mao. I don't think it even gets to Lenin, let alone Stalin.
At their best, I said.
It's a mix of Hart and Negri and some anthropologists that I'm too old to have read, and it's a very different kind of a scene. However, there's one thing that I want to get your opinion on, both of you. I feel that entire kind of messianic Marxism, this Marxism that was too cool for history, that Marxism that was above any kind of real contradiction, I think it is now in a very deep crisis with two things. One, with the genocide in Gaza, and with the ascendance of far-right governments across the Western world. People are becoming more realistic. I think there's a certain kind of disciplining that fascism or the right imposes on sections of even the liberal intelligentsia or the posers, Marxist posers. And I think that is the kind of realism that was imposed on the Soviet Union in the 20s and 30s. So that is a very controversial thing for a lot of people to say, but if you and I were in government in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, we would have been paranoid as hell, and we would have actually supported the rapid industrialization of the Soviet Union if we were in our senses. And actually that was the only path to victory against fascism. And yes, it's true, absolutely true, that the Red Army and the Soviet Union defeated fascism. It's something that Tucker Carlson, in this amazing conversation with Piers Morgan that he had, he said World War II was not a real victory because it was Stalin and the Red Army that won. It wasn't a victory for the Western civilization. So do you see that after the crises of these last 2-3 years, that there is this possibility, a real palpable possibility of the resurgence of a very serious, grounded left, grounded in the actual history, actual practices of liberation, rather than this fidelity to text, even if reality diverges from it?
I would say, to start with, that your statements about the social chauvinism of the imperial left are very important, because when you think of the history of the educational institutions in the imperial core, the reason that in many ways they're more developed than what you find in the colonial periphery, and that's not a moralistic statement, it's just a descriptive statement, is because of the history of imperialism. You underdevelop the rest of the world in order to develop certain elements of your society in the imperial core. And so if you come from the periphery and you study in the core, you're often given the sense that, well, this is the most developed form of theory available. And what people don't recognize is that, given that they're studying in the imperial superstructure, right? They're studying in institutions that are driven by empire. What they're actually studying and what they're being trained in are intellectual tools that are at the rear guard of history. Meaning these are the forces that are holding back humanity from development. In that regard, the vanguard of history, the intellectual, not just the political, but the intellectual vanguard of history, are those people who collectively are working together to theoretically elucidate how you break the chains of imperialism and introduce a socioeconomic system in which the value goes to the people and saving the planet. And so anyone who's trained in or goes to the Imperial Corps should keep it very clearly in mind where they're going, what they're being trained in, and why. They're being trained to become the comprador class that goes back locally and reproduces the imperial ideology and functions as the rear guard of history. They are the custodians who are holding history back. Don't allow yourself to be indoctrinated into that. The reason that I say that, and the reason I'm so critical of it, is because I was trained in imperial ignorance. That was the most important thing that I was trained in studying at very prestigious institutions in France and the United States. But the second thing that I'd say is I think you're absolutely right that there's the genocide, the rise of fascism, but there is just in general, both of those phenomena, the genocide and the rise of fascism across the capitalist world are due to the declining power of US-led imperialism in the world and the ongoing rise of China and a multipolar world. The world system is in crisis. I mean, the world system has always been in crisis, but it is sharpening. And the sharpening of those contradictions means that people are going to be forced and are being forced to materially recognize things that they might ideologically be undisposed to recognize. And as the great Michael Parenti often said, reality is radical. Because reality is poverty, no housing, unemployment, imperialist violence, social murder, etc. And the reality that we live in is increasingly radical. And so that means, and I see it very clearly in the Imperial Corps, as much as people try to police Marxism, there are these young people who are looking at the world, the environment's going to shit, and there's not going to be a world left. There's a genocide going on. There's endless wars. Infrastructure is crumbling. Everything's polluted. People are going bankrupt due to not being able to pay the healthcare costs, on and on and on. And then they encounter historical and dialectical materialism that explains why that is the case, and very importantly, how to overcome that situation. And so we, to link to what I said earlier, need to do everything that we can to flesh out the broader infrastructure, to bring people in, provide them with the educational tools, not because we know everything, we're dogmatic, we have the truth, but because we are part of a collective process of education that is trying to contribute to the vanguard of history. And we need everybody. We need all the brilliant people out there to get on board with this project if we're going to stop the cataclysm, which is global imperialism.
Yeah, I'll agree with all of that. I might just add a couple of thoughts. We talked about the ideological assault, say in Poland in the 1970s, which was part of a much broader assault by the imperial countries against the Third World Project. It was a financial assault through the reimposition or the imposition of the dollar as the global reserve currency, the increased use of sanctions as a tool of war, the imposition of debt, which was also a massive contributor to the collapse of the socialist projects of Eastern Europe. It was a military assault with renewed military aggressions in different parts of the world. And so you had this multifaceted war that escalated in the 1970s and then totalized with the collapse of the Soviet Union, because there was no counterweight, no material counterweight to that, which allowed the kind of the instruments and the ideological, financial, and otherwise to seep into every crack, every crevice and pore of societies that were able to withstand it, with some exceptions. Cuba was able to withstand that assault. And in fact, when you had a massive, devastating mortality crisis in the former Soviet Union, life expectancy increased in Cuba, another testament to the resilience and capacities of socialism. But you had, again, the consolidation of these weapons, of these tools of imperialism, which are now starting to become ingredients in the West's decline, right? Countries have reconstructed the base of their sovereignty, or have started to do that. And I've started to think, okay, we have sanctions. How do we circumvent those sanctions? What are the kinds of infrastructures we can build to work around them? How can we move away from the dollar so that we're no longer beholden to U.S. financial interests? So we're no longer at risk from the volatility of U.S. financial markets. How do we begin to oppose the expansion of U.S. militarism, chiefly in places like the Pacific and in Ukraine? And so solutions are emerging in different forms in different parts of the world, which are chiseling away at the hegemony of the West in a very significant way. And I think people are starting to realize that, right? The empire is now financially over-leveraged, it's militarily overextended, and especially after the genocide in Gaza, it's ideologically exhausted. No one believes the West anymore. And you see that even in places like Germany, right? Deeply reactionary societies where people are starting to mobilize, people are starting to ask questions. But what's lacking, as you've insisted rightly, Gabriel, is organization. There is no container into which we can absorb these energies, into which we can transform them into a revolutionary, transformative project. And so what ends up happening is they end up falling into the clutch of the far right, which speaks the language of radicalism, sometimes operates with the aesthetic of radicalism, but strips it of all of its transformative and political content. And this is happening very quickly in large parts of the world. And so there's a very deep crisis of organization. I think it's certainly tied to the question of education, because education has always been central to emancipatory political projects. But we lack the structures, the organizations, the institutions, the infrastructures that can mobilize people at scale and give them answers to the very real problems that are emerging as Europe deindustrializes and the social crisis in the US really escalates beyond all proportion. We don't have the capacities to organize these people and to explain to them what it is that's happening. And that is a profound risk. And I agree that, this is the task of our generation, the most important task of our generation, to overcome that organizational, institutional impasse. And that is, a project that Ammar is very closely involved in. That is a project that I hope I'm very closely involved in as well. And may we make headwinds, and may we...
Well, I was actually about to say, the way you're working, I think we don't have much to worry about. I think we're going to create those organizations. I think there's a lot of vacuum. There's a lot of, you can feel the excitement among the youth. It's palpable across the world. I've been going to universities. I mean, they don't let me inside universities in Pakistan anymore, but outside universities, 200, 300 young people coming to lectures on Marxism. We did something on Osordo. We did something on a number of other thinkers. There's a lot of space, and people are coming out of the defeatism that shaped our subjectivity for so long. And I think that the Max Heil in our last discussion made that good point. That's not just about defeating a people. It's actually the bigger victory of empire is to impose a subjectivity of defeat. So even if there are opportunities of winning, people see them as already foreclosed because they have already imbibed the subjectivity of defeat. So we have to end soon. So I have one last question for you, Gabriel. And on this, as people move towards this decisive victory that we're going to have in the 21st century against empire, as academics, particularly young academics, graduate students, a lot of people that I work with, a lot of people that you work with, a lot of people that follow you with a lot of enthusiasm, and feel very conflicted by the fact that they're part of the theory industry or part of Western academia. What advice do you give to them? Marxists following you, following Losordo, Marx, other radical thinkers, wanting to make an actual difference in the real world. But also they have families to feed, they have careers to make. It's a very, we talked about ranking of class struggles. So also tactics are important. We don't want people to lose their jobs. We want more and more people to occupy positions of power. That's the kind of leftist tradition that we come from. I know it kind of makes you the old wise man. You're wise but not old. But I do think a lot of my students ask me that question, and because I'm no longer in the academy, but you're holding the fort. So what is your advice to young Marxists who want to make an actual difference, but also want to make a place within academia?
Well, I think you have to find a way of figuring out what your best possible contribution is to the broader collective struggle and how to plug into that. And that can take a lot of different forms. And it can also mean that in a capitalist world, or like in a country like the United States, you do live in contradictions. That's my case. And if you pursue, because for young intellectuals, I mean, there are many venues, right? You can become a journalist, you can become a political organizer, you can become a union organizer. There's lots of different things that people can do. And part of it, I think, really is figuring out what your forte is and where you can make the best possible contribution across the board, because we need all hands on board. We need lawyers, we need doctors, we need engineers, we need everyone. And so that's part of it. And then figuring out tactically how one can both survive and also get access to the material conditions necessary to do the work that you need to do. And so it is true, if you're able to get a university position and have time to do research, that's different than a number of jobs that I've worked in the past where you work 9 to 5 or 8 to 7 or whatever, and then you're exhausted and you don't have the same amount of time to dedicate yourself to doing research and analysis. And so there's no easy solution. It's really a balancing act between different forces. Getting involved collectively with organized politics in various different ways is essential, so that you're not just doing theoretical work. And this can be student orgs, unions, political parties, many different associations and things like this, because it will also continue to train you in ways that the intellectual world doesn't train you about what it's like to make tactical sacrifices, to work with others, to work collectively. And that's part of, when we were talking earlier with Pawel about the need to rebuild this kind of educational infrastructure, a lot of what we need to learn is also just practical, like real practical organizing tools. And that type of knowledge, there's an enormous amount of collective knowledge regarding that. We need to tap into it. We need to learn more from it. And we need to push it down the road, meaning that we need to learn more so that we can train others in that process as well. So this might not be a totally satisfactory answer because it's complicated. It will depend on, individuals. I guess maybe the last thing that I would say is make sure that in spite of all of the complexities that one can introduce through dialectical analysis, at the end of the day, dialectical analysis is not about obscuring the world. It's about doing a fine-grained analysis, but also identifying, very importantly, what side you are on. Because there are imperialists and there are anti-imperialists. And we need to be very clear and very principled on that front, so that we can keep the horizon, the strategic horizon of our struggles clearly in focus, even if we do make tactical sacrifices, which sometimes we have to do, because the overall goal should not just be, I'm going to have a comfortable life and make my little contribution. The overall goal is contributing to the collective struggle. And that's also, not to circle back to your religious statements earlier, if you're looking for meaning in life, like, don't look for it in a sacred text or some messianic beyond. Look for it here in the collective struggle of being part of something that's much larger than yourself, much more important than yourself and all the people that you know personally, because it's about the liberation of humanity and the salvation of planet Earth. What better cause materially to be dedicated to and involved in than that? Right. And that gives me, inspiration, not hope in some vacuous sense, but that you're part of something struggling with other people. So get plugged into that, because it also gives people passion and fire and excitement about being part of a broader world project. And that's what Red Star is doing, right? That's part of your project. And so I'm thrilled to be able to connect with you on this platform and hopefully push in precisely that direction of developing a really vital international community of scholars, activists, artists who are pushing in the right direction and working together and supporting one another in struggles that sometimes are also very difficult and very hard.
That was absolutely beautiful, Gabriel. And that's exactly what we want to do. That's exactly what moves a lot of us, this common struggle that a lot of people before us have participated in, a lot of people after we leave planet Earth will participate in, as a struggle for reclaiming a common humanity, equality, dignity. And that is a sufficient reason for us to continue on the path that we've chosen. I don't think anything else needs to be said. Thank you so much, both Pawel and Gabriel, and to all our viewers. Please like and subscribe the Red Star, and we'll be back with another episode soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and keep up the great work.
Thank
Thank you.